started with a bang, literally. A thunderous pounding on my front door at 7 a.m. The kind of knock that makes you think either the apocalypse has arrived early or someone's about to serve you legal papers. I stumbled out of bed, still half asleep, and opened the door to find none other than Karen Whitmore standing there, looking like she just stepped out of a suburban HOA promotional video, clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched on her nose despite the lack of sun, and an air of self-importance so thick you could cut it with a knife. "Mr. Miller," she began, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension that makes your blood pressure spike instantly. "I'm here on behalf of the Homeowners Association to address some serious violations on your property. Now, let me pause here for a second. My ranch is not part of the HOA. Never has been, never will be. It's a standalone property, legally exempt from their rules and regulations. But Karen? Oh no. Karen doesn't let little things like facts get in the way of her crusade for neighborhood domination." "Violations?" I asked, rubbing my eyes and trying to process what was happening. "Karen, this isn't even HOA property." She ignored me completely and launched into her spiel like she was auditioning for a role in a courtroom drama. "Your fence is too high according to HOA guidelines. Your barn is painted an unapproved color. Red is not on the approved palette. And your driveway gravel is not up to HOA standards." I blinked at her, genuinely unsure if I was still dreaming or if this was some elaborate prank. "Karen," I said slowly, "this ranch has been here since before your HOA even existed. It's legally excluded from your jurisdiction." Karen scoffed like I just told her gravity wasn't real. "That's irrelevant," she snapped. "Your property is visible from the road, and it affects the aesthetic integrity of our community." Yes, the aesthetic integrity of a community where half the houses have inflatable Christmas decorations year-round and the other half have lawns that look like they've been through a drought apocalypse. "Look," I said, trying to keep my cool. "I don't know what power trip you're on right now, but you have no authority here. If you don't mind, I'd like to go back to enjoying my coffee and pretending this conversation never happened." And then, oh boy, Karen dropped the bombshell. "If you don't comply," she said with a smug smile, "I'll be forced to escalate this matter to law enforcement." Now, I don't know about you, but being threatened with police action over the color of my barn felt like peak suburban insanity. I stared at her for a moment before deciding I wasn't going to waste another second entertaining her nonsense. "Good luck with that," I said as I closed the door in her face. But Karen doesn't take rejection well. As soon as the door clicked shut, I heard her yelling something about calling 911 and reporting me as a dangerous individual refusing to comply with community standards. I laughed to myself as I walked back into my kitchen. Dangerous individual? Lady, I'm a DEA agent who's spent years busting drug rings and dealing with actual criminals. If she thought she could intimidate me with her HOA clipboard and empty threats, she was in for a rude awakening. About 10 minutes later, just enough time for me to pour myself another cup of coffee, I heard sirens in the distance. And sure enough, 2 squad cars pulled up outside my ranch while Karen stood there waving them down like she was directing traffic. I stepped outside onto my porch as 2 officers approached me cautiously. They looked confused but professional, clearly trying to figure out why they'd been called out here for what sounded like an argument over property lines. "Morning," I said cheerfully, holding up my coffee mug in greeting. "What brings you gentlemen out here?" One of the officers glanced at Karen before turning back to me. "We received a call about a disturbance involving non-compliance with HOA regulations." I couldn't help but laugh. A full belly laugh that probably made me look slightly unhinged but felt entirely appropriate given the absurdity of the situation. "Officers?" I said once I'd caught my breath. "This property isn't part of the HOA. Never has been. Karen here seems to think she can enforce rules that don't apply." Karen immediately jumped in like she was auditioning for Judge Judy. "He's lying. His property is an eyesore and violates our community standards. He refused to cooperate when I tried to address it civilly." The officers exchanged glances that screamed, "Why are we here?" before one of them asked me for proof of ownership and exemption from HOA jurisdiction. "Gladly," I said as I went inside to grab my paperwork. The deed to my property and legal documents explicitly stating it wasn't under HOA governance. When I handed them over, one officer studied them carefully, while Karen stood there fuming like someone had just told her Starbucks was discontinuing pumpkin spice lattes. "Well," the officer finally said after a few minutes, "everything checks out here. This property isn't part of the HOA." Karen looked like she might spontaneously combust from sheer indignation. But, it should be," she stammered. "It's ruining our neighborhood." The officer sighed. A long-suffering sigh that suggested he'd dealt with one too many Karens in his career, and turned back to me. "Sorry for the inconvenience," he said politely before turning back to Karen. "Ma'am, calling 911 for non-emergencies is against protocol." Karen sputtered incoherently while I stood there grinning like an idiot because honestly, watching her meltdown was better than anything Netflix could offer. As the officers drove away and Karen stormed off muttering threats under her breath about taking me to court or rallying HOA members against me, I leaned against my porch railing and took another sip of coffee. It wasn't even 8 a.m. yet, but somehow it felt like I'd already won the day. The next day, I thought the whole Karen debacle was behind me. I mean, surely even she had to realize that calling the cops on me for not following HOA rules that didn't apply to my property was a losing battle. But no. This is Karen we're talking about. If there's one thing Karens are known for, it's their relentless commitment to being the absolute worst. It started around noon when I was out in my barn fixing up some fencing equipment. I heard the unmistakable sound of tires crunching on gravel and peeked out the door to see Karen's SUV pulling into my driveway like she owned the place. She stepped out, clipboard in hand again, and marched up to my front porch with all the confidence of someone who's never been told no in her life. I sighed and walked out to meet her halfway. "Karen," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "what are you doing here? Didn't we settle this yesterday?" She gave me a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, Mr. Miller," she said, her tone dripping with fake politeness. "I'm here to inform you that the HOA board has decided to escalate this matter. We've filed an official complaint against you." I raised an eyebrow. "A complaint? About what?" Karen flipped through her clipboard like she was reading off a list of war crimes. "Failure to comply with community standards, unauthorized construction on your property, and," she paused for dramatic effect, "creating a hostile environment for HOA members." I stared at her, dumbfounded. "Hostile environment? Karen, I haven't even spoken to anyone from your HOA except you." She ignored me and continued. "We've also decided that your property's proximity to our neighborhood means it falls under our jurisdiction by default. Now, I'm no lawyer, but even I know that's not how jurisdiction works." "Karen," I said slowly, "you can't just decide my property is part of the HOA because it's near your neighborhood. That's not how any of this works." She smirked like she'd just checkmated me in a game of chess. "Oh, but it is," she said. "Our bylaws state that any property within a half-mile radius of the community can be subject to HOA oversight if it impacts the overall aesthetic." I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. "Karen," I said, shaking my head, "your bylaws don't override state law or my deed. You can't just make up rules and expect me to follow them." Her face turned red, whether from anger or embarrassment, I couldn't tell, and she snapped, "We'll see what the court has to say about that." And with that, she stormed back to her SUV and sped off down the driveway. Now, most people would probably be worried at this point. The idea of going up against an HOA in court isn't exactly appealing. They're notorious for dragging out legal battles and burying people in paperwork until they give up. But me, I wasn't worried at all. In fact, I was kind of looking forward to it. You see, what Karen didn't know, and what made this whole situation so hilariously ironic, is that part of my job as a DEA agent involves dealing with legal disputes over property rights all the time. I've spent years working with lawyers, reading through endless contracts and deeds, and learning every loophole in the book. If Karen wanted a fight, she was about to get one. The next morning, I got a call from a local attorney who introduced himself as representing the HOA. He sounded apologetic, probably because he'd already realized how ridiculous this whole thing was. But he informed me that they were officially filing a lawsuit against me for non-compliance with HOA regulations. I thanked him for letting me know and told him I'd be happy to see them in court. But before things could get that far, Karen decided to take matters into her own hands again, because apparently filing a lawsuit wasn't enough drama for her. That afternoon, while I was out running errands in town, Karen showed up at my ranch with 2 other members of the HOA board in tow. They parked their cars right in front of my gate and started taking pictures of my property like they were paparazzi staking out a celebrity scandal. When I got back home and saw them there, I couldn't believe my eyes. These people were standing on public land outside my fence line with cameras and clipboards like they were conducting some kind of official inspection. I walked up to them and asked what they thought they were doing. "We're documenting evidence for our case," Karen said smugly. "Evidence?" I repeated incredulously. "Karen, you're trespassing on private property right now." She scoffed. "We're not on your property, we're on public land adjacent to it." I couldn't help but laugh at how desperate she was getting. "Fine," I said with a shrug. "Take all the pictures you want. Just make sure you get my good side." That seemed to throw her off balance for a moment before she recovered and snapped back into full Karen mode. "This isn't a joke," she shouted. "You can't just ignore the rules because you think you're above them." At this point, one of the other board members, a middle-aged man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, cleared his throat awkwardly and muttered something about needing to leave soon. But Karen wasn't ready to give up yet. She pointed at my barn and said loudly enough for everyone within earshot to hear, "That structure is an eyesore. It's bringing down property values for everyone in our community." I crossed my arms and leaned against the gatepost casually as I replied, "Funny you should mention property values, because according to county records, your house is worth less than half of what mine is." The look on her face was priceless. A mix of shock, outrage, and utter disbelief. And before she could come up with another retort, one of her companions grabbed her arm and whispered something in her ear. Reluctantly, and with one final glare in my direction, Karen turned around and marched back toward her car without another word. As they drove away down the road, kicking up dust behind them like some kind of defeated villain retreating from battle, or at least that's how it felt, I couldn't help but smile at how ridiculous this entire situation had become. Little did Karen know, she had just made things even worse for herself by giving me exactly what I needed. Proof that she was harassing me without cause or authority, a fact that would come back to haunt her sooner than later. By the time Karen and her little HOA entourage had driven off, I was done playing defense. It was time to go on the offensive. If Karen wanted to escalate this into a full-blown war over my property, then I was going to make sure she regretted every second of it. And let me tell you, when you've spent years working for the DEA, you learn a thing or two about gathering evidence and building a case. Karen had no idea what she'd just signed up for. The first thing I did was call up my buddy Mike, who happens to be a lawyer specializing in property disputes. Mike's the kind of guy who can quote zoning laws off the top of his head and has a borderline unhealthy obsession with taking down overreaching HOAs. When I told him what was going on, he laughed so hard I thought he might choke. "Wait," he said between gasps for air. "She's trying to claim your ranch is under HOA jurisdiction because it's near her neighborhood? That's not even remotely legal." "Yeah," I replied. "But she's already filed a complaint and started harassing me with her little clipboard brigade." Mike chuckled again. "All right, send me everything you've got. Deeds, photos, any correspondence with her or the HOA. We're gonna shut this down so hard she won't know what hit her." With Mike on board, I felt like I finally had the upper hand. But I wasn't content to just sit back and let him handle everything. No, I wanted to make sure Karen got a taste of her own medicine. So I started documenting everything. Every time she drove by my property, every time she sent one of her HOA minions to snoop around, every passive-aggressive note she left in my mailbox. I kept a record of it all. And then came the moment that really kicked things into high gear. One afternoon, about a week after Karen's last visit, I was out mowing my lawn when I noticed something strange near the edge of my property. There was a small wooden stake in the ground with an orange flag attached to it, like the kind surveyors use. Curious, I walked over and found several more stakes forming a rough line along the border between my ranch and the public road. Now, I'm no expert on land surveying, but even I could tell this wasn't normal. So I called up the county assessor's office to see if there were any recent surveys or changes to my property lines. The woman on the other end of the line was incredibly helpful, and incredibly confused. "No," she said after checking her records. "There haven't been any new surveys filed for your property. Are you saying someone put those stakes there without authorization?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," I replied. "Well," she said with a hint of amusement in her voice, "that's definitely not allowed. You might want to file a complaint with code enforcement." I thanked her for the advice and hung up, already grinning at the thought of turning Karen's own tactics against her. If she wanted to play dirty, fine, but two could play that game. The next day, I filed an official complaint with the County Code Enforcement Office about unauthorized surveying activity on my property. And because I'm nothing if not thorough, I included photos of the stakes along with timestamps and GPS coordinates. Within 48 hours, an inspector was out at my ranch taking notes and shaking his head in disbelief. "This is definitely a violation," he said as he pulled one of the stakes out of the ground. "Whoever did this is in big trouble." "Oh, I know exactly who did it," I replied with a smirk. The inspector raised an eyebrow but didn't press for details. Instead, he promised to follow up with his supervisor and let me know what actions would be taken. Meanwhile, Karen must have sensed that things weren't going her way because she started ramping up her harassment campaign. She sent me multiple letters demanding that I attend an HOA meeting to resolve our dispute. Letters that I promptly forwarded to Mike so he could add them to our growing pile of evidence against her. Then came the cherry on top. Karen decided to post about me in the HOA's private Facebook group. Now, normally this wouldn't have been an issue because obviously I'm not part of their group, but one of my neighbors, who also hates Karen, sent me screenshots of everything she wrote. It was pure gold. Karen accused me of being a menace to the community and claimed that my refusal to follow HOA rules was causing irreparable damage to property values in the neighborhood. She even went so far as to suggest that my barn might be used for illegal activities, because apparently having a red barn is now grounds for suspicion. When Mike saw those screenshots, he practically jumped out of his chair with excitement. "This is defamation," he said, grinning from ear to ear. "She just handed us another weapon for your counterclaim." That's right, counterclaim. Because by this point, Mike had already filed our response to Karen's lawsuit along with a countersuit alleging harassment, defamation, and abusive process. And thanks to all the evidence we gathered, including those Facebook posts, we had a rock-solid case. But here's where things really got interesting. About 2 weeks before our first court date, Karen made one final attempt to assert her authority over my property, and it backfired spectacularly. I came home one evening to find that someone had put up an HOA sign at the entrance to my driveway. It was one of those official-looking signs with bold letters spelling out, "Private property, HOA access only." The audacity was almost impressive, almost. I immediately took pictures and called Mike, who couldn't stop laughing long enough to give me any actual legal advice. "Just leave it there for now," he finally managed to say between chuckles. "It'll make great evidence." And he was right, because when we finally got our day in court, that sign ended up being one of the key pieces of evidence that convinced the judge Karen had crossed every possible line. But let me tell you, watching her squirm as we presented our case, that was worth every second of this ridiculous ordeal. The day of the court hearing finally arrived, and let me tell you, I was ready. Armed with a mountain of evidence, my lawyer Mike by my side, and a healthy dose of righteous indignation, I walked into that courtroom like a man on a mission. Karen, on the other hand, strutted in like she was about to win an award for most overbearing HOA president. She had her clipboard tucked under her arm, her hair sprayed into submission, and her expression set to smug superiority. The judge, a no-nonsense woman who looked like she'd seen every petty dispute imaginable, called the session to order and asked Karen's lawyer to present their case. Now, I'll give credit where credit's due. Karen's lawyer tried his best. He stood up and started talking about how my property was negatively impacting the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood, and how the HOA bylaws allowed them to enforce standards on properties within a certain radius. But then Mike stood up and calmly handed the judge a copy of my property deed along with a detailed legal analysis proving that my ranch was explicitly excluded from HOA jurisdiction. He didn't even need to say much, just pointed out the facts and let them speak for themselves. The judge glanced at the documents, nodded, and turned back to Karen's lawyer. "Do you have any evidence to refute this?" she asked. Karen's lawyer hesitated for a moment before admitting, "No, Your Honor." Karen looked like she'd just swallowed a lemon. But the real fun began when Mike presented our counterclaim. He started by showing the judge all the photos and videos I'd taken of Karen and her HOA minions trespassing on my property. Then he pulled out copies of the letters Karen had sent me demanding compliance with rules that didn't apply. And finally, oh, this was the best part, he handed over those screenshots from the HOA Facebook group where Karen accused me of running illegal activities out of my barn. The judge's eyebrows shot up as she read through the posts. "Ms. Whitmore," she said, fixing Karen with a stern look, "are you aware that making false statements about someone can constitute defamation?" Karen stammered something about protecting community values, but it was clear she was floundering. And then Mike dropped the hammer. He presented photos of that ridiculous HOA sign Karen had put up at the entrance to my driveway. "Your Honor," he said with a grin, "this sign was placed on my client's property without permission. It's not only trespassing, it's an attempt to assert authority where none exists." The judge leaned back in her chair and sighed. A long, exasperated sigh that seemed to say, "Why am I wasting my time on this nonsense?" "Ms. Whitmore," she said finally, "it's clear that you've overstepped your bounds in multiple ways. This court finds in favor of Mr. Miller on all counts." I swear I could hear angels singing in that moment. But it wasn't over yet. The judge turned back to Karen and said, "Furthermore, this court orders the HOA to pay damages for harassment and defamation as outlined in Mr. Miller's counterclaim." Karen's face turned bright red as she sputtered incoherently. Her lawyer looked like he wanted to crawl under the table and disappear. As we walked out of the courtroom later that day, Mike couldn't stop grinning. "Well," he said, clapping me on the back, "that went even better than I expected." "Yeah," I replied, still basking in the glow of victory. "But I don't think Karen's going to let this go quietly." And sure enough, she didn't. A few days later, I got a call from one of my neighbors, a nice older guy named Tom who'd lived in the area for decades. He told me there was an emergency HOA meeting happening that evening and suggested I come by to see what was going on. Now, normally I wouldn't set foot near an HOA meeting if you paid me, but curiosity got the better of me. So I showed up at their little clubhouse just in time to hear Karen giving an impassioned speech about how outsiders like me were threatening the fabric of their community. She went on for what felt like forever about how my barn was an eyesore and how my refusal to comply with her demands had set a dangerous precedent. At one point, she even suggested creating a new bylaw specifically targeting properties like mine. But here's where things took an unexpected turn. Halfway through her rant, one of the other board members stood up and interrupted her. "Karen," he said bluntly, "this has gone too far. You've embarrassed yourself and this HOA with your behavior." Karen froze mid-sentence, clearly stunned by the betrayal. Another board member chimed in, "We're tired of being dragged into your personal vendettas. It's time for you to step down as president." The room erupted into murmurs as more people voiced their agreement. Karen tried to argue, tried to defend herself, but it was obvious she'd lost their support. By the end of the meeting, they'd voted her out as president and replaced her with Tom, the same neighbor who'd tipped me off about the meeting in the first place. As I walked back to my truck that night, I couldn't help but laugh at how poetic it all was. Karen had spent weeks trying to make my life miserable, and in doing so, she'd managed to destroy her own reputation instead. The next morning, Tom stopped by my ranch with a bottle of whiskey as a peace offering from the HOA. "We're sorry about everything," he said sheepishly. "Karen doesn't represent us. We just want to be good neighbors." I accepted his apology and his whiskey with a smile. And just like that, life returned to normal at my ranch, except for one small change. I had a new sign made for my driveway that read asterisk, "Not part of HOA, do not disturb." Asterisk just in case anyone else got any ideas. After Karen was dethroned as HOA president, you'd think the saga would have ended there, right? Wrong. Because this is Karen we're talking about. If there's one thing a Karen can't do, it's admit defeat gracefully. But by this point, I was sitting pretty. I had my court victory, my driveway sign proudly declaring my independence from the HOA, and a newfound appreciation for how much chaos one clipboard-wielding suburban dictator could create. It all started about a week after the HOA coup. I was out in my yard, enjoying the peace and quiet that had finally returned to my life, when Tom, my new favorite neighbor, and the HOA's freshly elected president, pulled up in his pickup truck. He hopped out with a grin and handed me an envelope. "What's this?" I asked, eyeing it suspiciously. "It's from the HOA," he said, still grinning. "Don't worry, it's not another complaint. It's an apology letter we're sending to everyone you've had to deal with during this whole situation." I opened the envelope and couldn't help but laugh. Inside was a formal letter on HOA letterhead apologizing for Karen's behavior and promising that the board would strive to foster a more harmonious relationship with all members of the community. It was signed by every board member except Karen, of course. "Well," I said, folding the letter back up, "I appreciate the gesture, but I think Karen might need this apology more than I do." Tom chuckled and shook his head. "Oh, she's not taking this well at all. She's been going around telling anyone who'll listen that she was unfairly targeted, and that we're all conspiring against her." "Sounds about right," I said with a shrug. "Let me guess. She's planning her comeback already?" "Oh, absolutely," Tom said with a laugh. "She's already talking about running for president again next year." I rolled my eyes but couldn't help smiling. Well, good luck with that. But little did I know, Karen wasn't content to wait until next year to make her move. A few days later, I came home to find a flyer taped to my mailbox. It was printed on bright pink paper with bold black letters spelling out, asterisk, community meeting, take back our HOA, asterisk below that was a list of grievances against the current board, most of which were thinly veiled jabs at Tom, and a call to action urging residents to restore order by reinstating Karen as president. I couldn't stop laughing as I read it. The sheer audacity of this woman was honestly impressive at this point. The meeting was scheduled for that Saturday evening at the community clubhouse, and while I had no intention of attending, curiosity got the better of me once again. So I decided to swing by and see what kind of circus Karen was putting on this time. When I walked in, the room was already packed with residents, some looking genuinely concerned, others just there for the spectacle. Karen was standing at the front of the room, gesturing wildly as she launched into yet another impassioned speech about how she'd been wronged. "This community deserves strong leadership," she declared dramatically. "Leadership that isn't afraid to make tough decisions. Leadership that will protect our property values and uphold our standards." I leaned against the back wall with my arms crossed, trying not to laugh out loud as she continued her rant. "And let's not forget," she added with a pointed glare in Tom's direction, "the damage caused by allowing certain individuals to flout our rules without consequence." At that point, Tom stood up and calmly addressed the crowd. "Folks," he said in his usual laid-back tone, "we've already been through this. The courts have ruled that Mr. Miller's property is not part of the HOA and never has been. This isn't about protecting our community. It's about one person refusing to accept reality." The room erupted into murmurs as people started whispering to each other. Karen looked like she was about to explode but managed to keep her composure. "Barely. That doesn't change the fact," she snapped, "that his property is an eyesore and negatively impacts our neighborhood." At that moment, I decided it was time to speak up. "Karen," I said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "if you're so concerned about aesthetics, maybe you should start by cleaning up your own backyard." The room went silent as everyone turned to look at me, including Karen, whose face turned an impressive shade of red. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. "Oh," I said with a grin, "just that little pile of junk behind your house. You know, the one visible from the road? Pretty sure it violates your own HOA guidelines." Karen sputtered incoherently as someone in the audience muttered, "He's got a point." Tom seized the opportunity to regain control of the meeting. "All right," he said firmly. "I think we've heard enough for tonight. Let's take a vote. Who here supports reinstating Karen as president?" A few hands went up, mostly from Karen's inner circle, but it was clear she didn't have anywhere near enough support. "And who thinks we should move on and let this nonsense go?" Tom asked. Nearly every hand in the room shot up. Karen stormed out of the clubhouse without another word, leaving her clipboard behind in her haste. As people started filing out after her, several neighbors came up to me with sheepish smiles and apologies for everything that had happened. "Don't worry about it," I told them with a laugh. "If nothing else, it's been entertaining." By the time I got back home that night, I felt like a weight had finally been lifted off my shoulders. Karen might still be out there plotting her next move, but for now, peace had been restored. And honestly, the whole experience taught me an important lesson. Never underestimate how far some people will go for power, even if it's just over something as trivial as an HOA. So if you're dealing with your own Karen or facing off against an overzealous HOA board member, hang in there, stand your ground, and don't forget to document everything, because sometimes revenge is best served with receipts. Thanks for sticking around and listening to my story. If you enjoyed it, or if you've got your own HOA horror story to share, be sure to like this post, leave a comment below, and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any future updates. And remember, not all heroes wear capes. Some just refuse to paint their barns beige.